A fault the length of 700 miles sits locked, silent, and loaded beneath the Pacific Ocean floor right now. It has held that pressure for over 300 years. When it last broke in January of 1700, the shaking lasted several minutes, the coastline dropped, and a tsunami crossed the entire Pacific and killed people in Japan. Geologists can read that rupture in the soil, in drowned forests still standing at the waterline, in sediment layers that split in an instant and stayed split for centuries. The clock on the next one is running. Researchers are now publicly stating that a magnitude 8 or 9 earthquake along the Cascadia Subduction Zone, capable of affecting millions of people from Northern California to southern British Columbia, carries a real and measurable probability within the next 50 years. They're installing ocean floor sensors. They're modeling tsunami arrival times down to the minute. They're documenting exactly which buildings will collapse and exactly how many hospital beds do not exist. If you enjoy what you watch here, subscribing takes 1 second and helps us keep building content like this. We're going to cover the fault systems scientists are watching most closely right now, the cities sitting on ground that amplifies shaking, why critical infrastructure is quietly rated as dangerously unprepared, and what the slow, silent signals in the fault itself may already be telling us. Prepare yourselves. We begin. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, roughly 50 miles out to sea, two massive sections of Earth's outer shell are locked in a collision that has been building pressure for over 300 years. The ocean floor is pushing eastward. The continent is pushing back. Neither one moves. The energy from that standoff does not disappear. It accumulates, stored in the rock itself, the way stress builds in a bent piece of metal before it finally snaps. That locked boundary is the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It stretches roughly 700 miles from northern California all the way up through Oregon and Washington and into southern British Columbia. Along that entire length, the Juan de Fuca plate is grinding beneath the North American plate at a rate of about 1.5 inches per year. That sounds slow. Over 3 centuries, it adds up to a stored elastic strain that geologists describe as one of the largest accumulations of unreleased seismic energy on the planet. Subduction zones are the most powerful earthquake machines on Earth. Every magnitude 9 earthquake ever recorded has come from one: the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan. Both subduction zones. Both produced catastrophic tsunamis. Both exceeded the models scientists had prepared for them. Cascadia belongs to that same category of fault, and it has stayed quiet far longer than either of those did before they broke. The mechanism behind this is called elastic rebound. The plates lock together at their contact zone, and the rock on either side slowly bends under the strain. The land above the fault actually rises slightly as the pressure builds, millimeter by millimeter over decades. When the fault finally releases, that bent rock snaps back, the land drops, and the energy radiates outward as seismic waves traveling in every direction at once. Here is why that mechanism matters specifically in this case. The locked portion of the Cascadia fault is wide. Some estimates put the locked zone at roughly 60 to 80 miles across, measured from the trench inward toward the coast. The wider the locked zone, the more rock is bent. The more rock is bent, the larger the rupture when it comes. A full-length rupture of all 700 miles would release energy roughly 1,000 times greater than the magnitude 6.7 Northridge earthquake that killed 57 people and caused $40 billion in damage in Los Angeles in 1994. 1,000 times. GPS networks run by the United States Geological Survey and university research teams track the surface of the ground across the Pacific Northwest with millimeter precision. Those measurements confirm the locking. The coastline is being pulled slowly eastward and slightly upward. The strain is real, measurable, and ongoing. Every year that passes without a rupture is another year of accumulated pressure, added to a system that will eventually release all of it at once. That release, when it comes, would last several minutes, shaking intense enough to collapse structures, trigger landslides, and cause the coastline to drop by several feet in a matter of seconds. And then, within 15 to 30 minutes of that drop, the ocean would respond, What the geological record says about how this system has behaved in the past is something most people living above it have never been told in full. The evidence is written in the ground itself, in layers of mud and sand and drowned trees, and it tells a story that is considerably more alarming than the shaking alone. Buried a few feet beneath the marshes and tidal flats along the Oregon and Washington coasts, there are layers of dark soil that do not belong where they sit. Above them is grey marine sediment, the kind deposited by ocean water. Below them is the rich dark earth of land that was once above the tide line, supporting forests and grasses. That sharp boundary between the two, repeated at multiple sites up and down the coast, is the fingerprint of a coastline that dropped suddenly and was immediately flooded by the sea. Geologists call this stratigraphic evidence. Each buried soil layer represents one moment in time when the ground lurched downward during a massive earthquake, and the ocean rushed in. Researchers have identified multiple such layers along Cascadia's coast, stacked on top of each other at regular intervals going back several thousand years. Each one marks a great rupture. Each one is separated from the next by a gap of roughly 200 to 500 years. The trees tell the same story. Along certain stretches of the Pacific Northwest coast, the stumps and trunks of ancient cedar trees still stand at or near the waterline, or are exposed at low tide. These trees did not flood gradually. Their root systems and growth patterns confirmed they were living in dry, forested ground right up until the moment the land dropped. Then salt water killed them where they stood. Scientists have radiocarbon dated these ghost forests and matched them precisely to the buried soil layers in the marshes. This method of reading past earthquakes from soil and plant evidence is called paleoseismology. It does not deal in estimates or theoretical models alone. It reads the physical record that the earthquakes themselves left behind. And that record is unambiguous. Cascadia has ruptured repeatedly, on a geologically consistent cycle, for thousands of years. The most recent rupture happened on January 26, 1700. Scientists know the date with unusual precision because of a source that had nothing to do with North America. Japan keeps detailed historical records, and on that date, a tsunami struck the Japanese coast with no warning. Earthquake felt locally. The waves arrived at night, damaged homes and killed people in coastal villages. Japanese scholars recorded the event carefully. When modern researchers compared the timing of that tsunami's arrival to the travel time of waves crossing the Pacific from the Cascadia Fault, the numbers matched exactly. That 1700 rupture is estimated to have been a magnitude 9 earthquake. The shaking lasted several minutes. The coastline dropped by several feet along hundreds of miles of shoreline. A tsunami reached Japan, roughly 5,000 miles away, within hours. Communities along the Pacific Northwest coast had no time to move. Here is what the interval pattern adds to this picture. The gaps between past Cascadia ruptures range from roughly 200 to over 500 years. The current gap since 1700 is now 325 years. That puts the fault system somewhere inside its historical rupture window. Some segments of the fault may already be past their average recurrence interval. Scientists are careful to say that this does not mean a rupture is imminent. Faults do not keep perfect schedules, but the geological record makes one thing clear. This fault breaks. It breaks repeatedly. It breaks powerfully. And the longer it holds, the more the pressure builds toward the moment it releases again. The question seismologists are now asking is no longer whether it will happen. The question is what exactly will happen when it does, and whether the 3.5 million people living in its direct path will be ready. The answer to that depends heavily on understanding something that most people never think about: what the ground beneath those cities is actually made of, and how differently it behaves when the shaking starts. Measuring the pressure inside a locked fault is one of the most technically demanding things geoscientists do. The fault itself is buried miles underground. The stress is invisible. The buildup happens over decades and centuries. Getting any kind of real-time picture of what is happening inside the locked zone requires technology that did not exist a generation ago, and a global network of instruments that has only recently become precise enough to be genuinely useful. The primary tool is the Global Positioning System, used in a way most people never see: research-grade GPS receivers, anchored to bedrock at hundreds of locations across the Pacific Northwest and mounted on the ocean floor offshore, track their exact position continuously. When geophysicists analyze years of data from these receivers, they can measure how the ground surface is deforming, how fast it is moving, and which sections of the fault are locked versus which ones are slowly creeping and releasing small amounts of stress. The picture those measurements paint for Cascadia is consistent and clear. The coastal areas of Oregon and Washington are being compressed and pulled slightly eastward as the subducting plate drags on the continent above it. The strain is accumulating in the locked zone offshore. In some areas, the surface deformation measurements suggest the fault has been locked long enough and over a wide enough area that the stored elastic energy is substantial. Geophysicists use a concept called moment deficit to quantify this. Each year that passes without a rupture, the fault accumulates more seismic moment, essentially a measure of the energy stored by the ongoing plate motion. Decades of GPS data from Cascadia show the moment deficit growing year by year. When scientists calculate the total moment deficit accumulated since 1700 and compare it to the energy released by past Cascadia earthquakes, they find the stored energy is already sufficient to produce a major rupture across significant portions of the fault. This does not mean a rupture is guaranteed tomorrow, or next year, or even in the next decade. Earthquake prediction remains one of the hardest problems in all of science. Scientists cannot point to a specific day. What they can do is characterize the probability over longer timeframes, and those probability estimates are taken seriously enough that multiple federal and state agencies have built emergency response plans around them. One widely cited analysis estimated the probability of a full margin Cascadia rupture at roughly 10 to 15% over the next 50 years, with higher probabilities for partial ruptures that would still produce major shaking across large areas. A 10% chance over 50 years sounds manageable until you consider the scale of the consequence. The same probability logic applies to aircraft accidents. Engineers do not say 10% is acceptable when the outcome involves millions of people and a region-wide catastrophe. Compounding the picture is a pattern that geologists began identifying in the 1980s, one that adds a layer of complexity to how the fault stores and releases stress. Along certain sections of the Cascadia Fault, the ground moves in a way that does not match either locked behavior or steady creep. It moves in slow, silent pulses that last for days or weeks at a time and release stress equivalent to a moderate earthquake, without ever producing shaking anyone can feel. Those pulses are called slow slip events, and what scientists have been learning about them in recent years is changing how they think about the overall behavior of this fault system. That story, and what it may signal about where things stand right now, is considerably more unsettling than the GPS data alone. Most people thinking about earthquake risk in the Pacific Northwest picture Cascadia. It dominates the conversation, and for good reason. But roughly 30 miles south of downtown Seattle, running directly beneath the city and its suburbs, a separate fault system exists that operates on a completely different timescale and presents a threat that is in some ways harder to prepare for. The Seattle Fault Zone is not a single clean crack in the ground. It is a complex band of multiple fault strands, running roughly east to west across the entire Puget Sound region, directly beneath one of the most densely populated areas in the Pacific Northwest. Unlike Cascadia, which sits offshore and gives the ground some distance to absorb the first wave of shaking, the Seattle Fault runs through the urban core itself. An earthquake on this fault would begin directly beneath the buildings, roads, bridges, and water systems it crosses. Geologic evidence shows the Seattle Fault has produced enormous earthquakes in the past. About 1100 years ago, researchers believe the fault produced a rupture estimated at magnitude 7 or greater. The evidence includes a section of coastline along Puget Sound that was thrust upward by as much as 20 feet in that single event. Trees were buried when the land dropped in some areas, and a landslide entered Lake Washington, carrying enough material to generate a local wave recorded in the lake sediment. The scale of ground disruption across the region points to a rupture that would be catastrophic by any modern standard. What makes the Seattle Fault particularly difficult to plan around is the depth and complexity of the damage it would cause. A magnitude 7 earthquake directly beneath a major city produces a fundamentally different shaking pattern than a distant subduction zone event. The shaking arrives fast, hits hard, and comes from directly below. There is less time for any warning system to deliver useful notice. Shake Alert, the United States Geological Survey's early warning system now operational across the West Coast, would likely provide only a few seconds of warning for an event originating on a fault this close to the surface and this close to the city center. Those seconds still matter. Automated systems can stop trains, open fire station doors, and pause industrial equipment in that window. But for a person inside a building, a few seconds is enough time to drop, cover, and hold on, and little more. The buildings themselves are the deeper problem. Seattle, like many Pacific Northwest cities, contains a significant inventory of older, unreinforced masonry structures, buildings made of brick or concrete block, held together without the steel reinforcement that allows a structure to flex during shaking. These buildings do not bend, they collapse. Engineers have known for decades that these structures represent the single largest predictable source of earthquake deaths in American cities. Studies of past earthquakes in the United States and abroad confirm that unreinforced masonry failure accounts for a disproportionate share of fatalities in urban events. Seattle has made progress in identifying and in some cases retrofitting or demolishing its most vulnerable buildings. But the inventory of structures that remain dangerous is still significant. A major earthquake on the Seattle fault before that work is complete would test those structures exactly as the evidence predicts. And the Seattle fault is only one piece of the picture beneath Puget Sound. Additional fault structures cross the region, and the relationship between them, how stress on one might load another, is an active area of research with implications that go well beyond any single fault line. There is a phenomenon that has appeared in nearly every major urban earthquake of the last century, one that consistently destroys structures and infrastructure that were built to survive shaking, kills people in buildings that were supposed to be safe, and cuts off emergency access to exactly the areas that need it most. It does not require a building to be old or poorly constructed. It turns the ground itself into the hazard. Liquefaction happens when loose, water-saturated soil is shaken rapidly and the individual grains lose contact with each other. Under normal conditions, the friction between those grains is what gives soil its strength and allows it to support the weight of whatever is built on top. When earthquake waves pass through saturated soil, the shaking disrupts that grain-to-grain contact, and the soil behaves, briefly, like a thick liquid. Foundations sink, roads buckle and crack, underground pipes shear apart, buildings tilt or collapse even if their structural frames remain intact. The conditions required for liquefaction are common in exactly the places where cities tend to grow. River deltas, tidal flats, reclaimed land, and areas where loose sediment has been deposited by water over centuries are all highly susceptible. These are also the locations where ports, transportation hubs, and historic downtown cores frequently sit, because flat land near water has always been commercially valuable. Across the Pacific Northwest, those susceptible zones are mapped and studied. Portland, Oregon, sits on significant deposits of river sediment along the Willamette River. Large portions of Seattle's lowland neighborhoods and industrial areas occupy filled ground and ancient lake beds. Coastal communities throughout Oregon and Washington sit on beach deposits and estuary soils. During a major earthquake, the shaking from Cascadia or a local fault would trigger liquefaction across wide portions of all of these urban areas simultaneously. The consequences cascade quickly. Emergency vehicles cannot reach damaged areas over roads that have fractured and heaved. Water mains buried in liquefied soil rupture across entire neighborhoods at once, eliminating firefighting capacity at exactly the moment fires are most likely to start from broken gas lines. Fuel storage facilities built on susceptible ground risk tank failure and spill. Bridges with foundations in liquefiable soil can collapse, cutting off evacuation and supply routes that emergency planners count on. Japan's experience in 2011 illustrated this in precise detail. Even areas many miles from the fault rupture experienced extensive liquefaction in coastal lowlands and reclaimed areas. Neighborhoods sank, roads became impassable. The liquefaction damage alone, separate from the tsunami, caused billions of dollars in losses and complicated rescue operations for weeks. The Pacific Northwest has already seen liquefaction in smaller events. The 1965 Puget Sound earthquake and the 2001 Nisqually earthquake, both moderate events, both triggered documented liquefaction in susceptible zones. Engineers used those events to refine their maps of where the worst effects would concentrate during a major rupture. Those maps show that the areas of highest liquefaction risk align closely with the areas of highest population density and highest concentration of critical infrastructure. Soil conditions also control something called amplification, where certain ground types take incoming seismic waves and multiply their intensity before passing them upward to the surface. That mechanism works alongside liquefaction to make some areas dramatically more dangerous than others during the same earthquake. And the pattern it creates across a city like Seattle or Portland carries consequences that engineers and emergency planners are still working to quantify. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 in the afternoon local time, a fault off the northeastern coast of Japan broke along a roughly 300-mile stretch and released energy equivalent to the entire annual power consumption of the United States over several months. The rupture lasted approximately 6 minutes. The ground near the coast shook at intensities that exceeded the design limits of structures built to Japan's famously rigorous seismic code. And then, before the dust had settled, the ocean began to move. Japan is one of the most earthquake-prepared nations on Earth. Its building codes are among the strictest ever written. Its early warning system had been operational for years. Its coastal communities had tsunami evacuation routes marked, drilled, and practiced. Its seawall infrastructure along the Tohoku coast had cost billions of dollars and taken decades to build. Many of those seawalls, some nearly 40 feet tall, were overtaken by the tsunami within minutes of the fault rupturing. The death toll reached nearly 20,000 people. The tsunami traveled several miles inland in some locations. An entire coastal town, called Minami Sanriku, lost roughly 60% of its population in a single afternoon. 4 nuclear reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi plant suffered meltdowns after the tsunami overwhelmed their backup systems. The economic damage eventually exceeded $200 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in recorded history at the time. What makes Tohoku specifically relevant to the Pacific Northwest is the geological similarity between the two situations. The Japan Trench, where the Pacific Plate subducts beneath the North American Plate off Tohoku, and the Cascadia Subduction Zone share a fundamental structural profile. Both involve a dense oceanic plate descending beneath a lighter continental plate. Both have the capacity to produce magnitude 9 or greater earthquakes. Both have coastlines sitting in the path of tsunamis that would arrive with very little warning time. Before Tohoku, many Japanese scientists believed the Tohoku segment of the Japan Trench was incapable of producing a magnitude 9 earthquake. Paleoseismic evidence had suggested otherwise, but the prevailing model underestimated the fault. The rupture corrected that underestimation in the most devastating possible way. Pacific Northwest researchers drew a direct lesson from this. Before 2011, some models of Cascadia had focused primarily on partial ruptures of the fault's southern segments, treating a full 700-mile rupture as a lower probability scenario. Tohoku's lesson was that subduction zones can and do rupture fully, and that models built on incomplete historical data can systematically underestimate the worst-case outcome. Emergency planners in Oregon and Washington have since used Tohoku as a benchmark. The Federal Emergency Management Agency's Cascadia Rising exercise in 2016 simulated a full Cascadia rupture and mapped the response in explicit detail. The exercise found that within 72 hours, multiple coastal counties in Oregon and Washington would be effectively cut off from outside assistance. Roads and bridges would be destroyed or impassable. Hospital capacity would be overwhelmed. Fuel supplies would be interrupted. Japan spent the decade after Tohoku rebuilding its coastal defenses at a scale and cost that is difficult to fully comprehend. The Pacific Northwest, which watched all of this happen and conducted exercises that predicted similar outcomes in its own territory, has moved forward on preparation, but remains significantly behind the level of readiness Tohoku exposed as necessary. The gap between knowing and doing is exactly where the greatest risk now lives. In the late 1990s, seismologists studying GPS data from the Pacific Northwest noticed something unexpected. Every 12 to 15 months, a broad area of ground in the Cascadia region shifted slightly in the direction opposite to the normal creep caused by plate convergence. The movement was small, a fraction of an inch, and it lasted for days to weeks at a time. There was no earthquake. No one felt anything. The motion was entirely silent, detectable only because the GPS network had become precise enough to measure it. This phenomenon became known as a slow slip event. Researchers soon found it was happening on the deeper portion of the Cascadia Fault, in a zone below the main locked segment where the plate boundary transitions from a fully locked state to one capable of slow, gradual movement. During a slow slip event, stress is transferred between different parts of the fault system in a way that had never been captured in real time before this technology existed. The discovery was significant for several reasons. Slow slip events confirmed that the Cascadia Fault is not simply locked and static between major earthquakes. The fault system is dynamic. Stress moves around within it. The boundary between the locked shallow zone and the deeper slow slip zone is a place of active mechanical interaction, and understanding what happens at that boundary matters enormously for understanding how the stored energy in the shallow locked zone eventually gets released. Researchers in Canada, the United States, and Japan began documenting slow slip events in multiple subduction zones around the world. They found them in Japan before 2011. They found that in the months before the Tohoku earthquake, slow slip activity in the deeper fault had accelerated. Some researchers have proposed that slow slip events can transfer stress upward into the locked zone, potentially nudging a fault closer to rupture, though the scientific community is careful to note that this relationship is still an area of active research and genuine debate. The connection, if it exists consistently, is complex and not yet fully understood. In Cascadia, slow slip events occur at depths of roughly 15 to 25 miles, in the region directly landward of the locked zone. They happen on a remarkably regular cycle, repeating every 12 to 15 months in the northern segments and on somewhat different schedules in other parts of the fault. Scientists measure them using the GPS network and a complementary set of instruments called seismometers, which detect the faint tremors that accompany slow slip at depth. Those tremors are called episodic tremor and slip, and the combination of the ground motion signal and the tremor signal together allows researchers to map the slow slip zone in considerable detail. What that mapping shows is that the slow slip zone sits directly adjacent to and down dip of the locked zone where the next great earthquake will begin. The implication is that these two parts of the fault system are mechanically connected. What happens in the slow slip zone affects the stress state of the locked zone above it. Researchers are now analyzing whether changes in the timing, duration, or spatial extent of slow slip events might serve as an indicator of evolving conditions on the locked zone. The data from recent years suggests a pattern worth watching carefully, though scientists are cautious about drawing firm conclusions from a record that is still relatively short. What they have found below the slow slip zone, even deeper in the fault system, adds another layer to this picture that most people above ground have no idea exists. On the morning of October 17, 1989, the ground beneath the San Francisco Bay Area shook for 15 seconds. 67 people died. Portions of the Bay Bridge collapsed. A double-deck freeway in Oakland pancaked, killing 42 people in the upper decks fall onto the lower. The earthquake measured magnitude 6.9. Emergency responders described the first hours as organized chaos, with communication systems failing and rescue teams unable to quickly locate and reach the worst damage. 35 years later, the United States has a functioning earthquake early warning system operational across California, Oregon, and Washington. The system is called Shake Alert. It works by detecting the first seismic waves released by an earthquake at the source, the fast-moving but less damaging primary waves, and calculating the location and magnitude of the earthquake before the slower, more destructive secondary waves reach populated areas. It then sends alerts to phones, automated systems, and public infrastructure with seconds to tens of seconds of warning, depending on distance from the rupture. Those seconds are real, and they matter in specific, documented ways. Trains moving at speed can begin braking before the shaking arrives. Automated systems can stop surgical robots mid-procedure and open fire station garage doors. Elevators can move to the nearest floor and open their doors so occupants are not trapped. Gas lines can be shut automatically. Children in schools can drop and take cover. These are measurable, life-saving actions that a few seconds of warning enables. The honest account of shake alert's limitations, however, is important. For people living directly above or very close to a fault that ruptures, the warning time may be 0 to a few seconds because the destructive waves arrive nearly simultaneously with the detection. That is the scenario for a Seattle fault earthquake affecting central Seattle, or for communities near the Cascadia Offshore Zone, when the shaking radiates inland. The system performs best for people at a distance from the rupture, where the warning window is longer. Coverage and reliability have also expanded unevenly. While California's deployment is more mature, the Oregon and Washington components of Shake Alert expanded more recently and continue to be strengthened with additional sensors. The offshore component of the monitoring network is critical for Cascadia, because detecting a rupture that begins on the ocean floor and sending an alert before the shaking reaches coastal communities requires sensors positioned close to the fault. And the deep ocean environment makes installation and maintenance technically demanding and expensive. The Ocean Observatories Initiative and associated ocean floor monitoring programs have expanded the number of seafloor seismometers in the Cascadia region, improving the system's ability to detect and characterize an offshore rupture quickly. But researchers are direct in saying that the current network, while substantially better than what existed a decade ago, still has gaps in offshore coverage that could delay the first detection of a Cascadia rupture by critical seconds. The warning system is one layer of a larger preparedness picture. It saves lives in the seconds before shaking. What happens in the hours, days, and weeks after is governed by a completely different set of systems, most of which depend on infrastructure remaining functional. In a Cascadia rupture, the infrastructure assessment is the most troubling part of the entire scenario, and it begins with the bridges. When engineers survey a region's earthquake vulnerability, they do not begin with the buildings most people think about. They begin with the systems that everything else depends on: bridges, water mains, fuel pipelines, power transmission lines, and hospitals. These are the structures and networks that determine whether a region can respond to a disaster at all. Damage them, and the ability to rescue people, fight fires, treat the injured, and restore order collapses along with them. In the Pacific Northwest, the assessment of that critical infrastructure is not classified or hidden. Multiple studies commissioned by state governments, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and academic institutions have evaluated the region's bridges, pipelines, and public systems against what a major Cascadia earthquake would produce. The results have been published. Engineers and emergency planners have read them. The picture they describe is serious enough that it has driven ongoing, if underfunded, efforts to retrofit the most critical structures. Oregon has been among the more transparent states in publishing its vulnerability data. A study of Oregon's highway bridge inventory rated a significant portion of the state's bridges as vulnerable to damage or collapse in a major Cascadia earthquake. Many of these bridges cross rivers and waterways along the Interstate 5 corridor, the primary north-south artery connecting Oregon's major cities to each other and to the rest of the West Coast. A Cascadia rupture that damages or collapses multiple bridges along that corridor would effectively sever the state's central transportation spine. Water systems face a parallel problem. The pipes that carry drinking water beneath Pacific Northwest cities are largely buried in soil that includes significant areas of liquefiable material. When those soils liquefy, buried pipes experience lateral spreading, settlement, and shear forces they were never designed to withstand. Studies of past earthquakes, including the Kobe earthquake in Japan in 1995 and the Christchurch earthquakes in New Zealand in 2010 and 2011, documented water system failures so extensive that some neighborhoods lost water service for months. Fuel infrastructure adds another layer. The Pacific Northwest's primary fuel supply moves through a network of pipelines and marine terminals concentrated in specific coastal and lowland locations. Many of those locations sit on susceptible soil. A major earthquake that disrupts fuel supply simultaneously with road closures and bridge damage creates a situation where emergency generators, rescue vehicles, and hospital backup systems all compete for a shrinking supply of fuel that cannot easily be replenished. Hospitals themselves represent one of the starkest vulnerabilities. California passed laws after the Northridge earthquake requiring hospitals to meet upgraded seismic standards by specific deadlines, a process that took decades and cost billions. Oregon and Washington have addressed some of the most critical facilities, but retain a significant number of hospital structures built before modern seismic codes were established. Structures that engineers rate as potentially unable to remain operational after a major earthquake. The concentration of these vulnerabilities is what makes the infrastructure picture so difficult. Each failure multiplies the effect of the others. Broken water mains undermine the ability to fight fires. Impassable bridges prevent fuel resupply. Damaged hospitals reduce the capacity to treat the injured. In a large Cascadia scenario, these cascading failures would occur simultaneously across a geographic area, spanning hundreds of miles, stretching every emergency response capacity well past its limits. The population sitting inside that scenario is larger than it has ever been, and it has grown fastest in exactly the areas the models identify as highest risk. 40 years ago, the Pacific Northwest was one of the fastest growing regions in the United States, and that growth was concentrated in specific places: flatland near water, served by highways and rail lines, close to ports and commercial centers. Those locations were economically ideal. Geologically, many of them represent some of the most hazardous ground in North America when measured against earthquake risk. Portland's metropolitan area has grown to more than 2.5 million people. A substantial portion of that population lives and works on the alluvial flats of the Willamette Valley, where centuries of river sediment have created the soft, loose soil conditions most prone to amplified shaking and liquefaction. The river-adjacent neighborhoods and the industrial areas north of the city center sit on some of the highest risk ground in the region. Studies of ground amplification in Portland show that certain soil zones can multiply incoming seismic wave intensity by a factor of several times compared to bedrock sites nearby. Seattle's population has grown past 750,000 in the city proper, with the broader metro area exceeding 4 million people. The city's geography is defined by hills and lowlands, and the lowlands, including the Duwamish River Valley, significant portions of the former tidal flats south of downtown, and the land beneath the stadiums and industrial facilities on the south end of Elliott Bay, all sit on fill and soft sediment. These areas score poorly on liquefaction susceptibility maps. They are also densely occupied and economically critical. The coastal towns of Oregon and Washington represent a different category of risk, smaller in population but uniquely exposed to the tsunami threat. Communities like Seaside, Cannon Beach, and Astoria in Oregon, and Westport and Ocean Shores in Washington sit at or near sea level on low coastal land, directly in the path of a Cascadia tsunami. Researchers using National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration models have simulated the inundation zones for a full Cascadia rupture and found that some of these towns would be almost completely inundated. The warning time for the first wave to reach some of these locations is estimated at 15 minutes or less. Population growth has increased the number of people in these zones. The Pacific Northwest coast has become a popular destination for retirement and remote work relocation over the past 2 decades, drawing people who are attracted to the scenery and largely unaware of the geologic context of where they are settling. Local officials who understand the tsunami risk face a persistent challenge, communicating the severity of the hazard to a population that has never experienced a major Cascadia event and has no personal reference for what one would mean. Compounding this is the housing stock. Coastal communities with limited tax bases have older buildings, many of which predate modern seismic standards. Retrofitting is expensive and often economically unfeasible for individual homeowners. The result is that the population exposed to the worst tsunami inundation is also often living in the housing least prepared to survive the shaking that comes before the water arrives. State governments in Oregon and Washington have invested in public education campaigns, updated inundation maps, and tsunami evacuation route signage. Some communities have built vertical evacuation structures, reinforced concrete towers, or elevated berms designed to give people in flat coastal areas somewhere to go when the ground shakes and there is no high ground within reach. The number of those structures remains a fraction of what planners say is needed for full coastal coverage, and the pace of construction has been constrained by funding limits that public awareness alone has not yet broken through. The scale of who is exposed is only part of what determines the outcome. The other part is how many seconds they have before the worst arrives. Earthquake early warning is one of the most consequential applications of real-time seismic monitoring ever developed, and the few seconds it provides are genuinely different from 0 seconds. But those seconds are not distributed equally. They depend almost entirely on where you are relative to where the fault ruptures. And in a Cascadia event, that relationship produces radically different outcomes for different communities. The physics of seismic wave propagation are fixed. The destructive shaking from an earthquake travels outward from the rupture at speeds of roughly 2 to 3 miles per second. A community 50 miles from the rupture zone gets the shaking approximately 20 to 25 seconds after it begins at the source. A community 150 miles inland gets perhaps 60 to 90 seconds of warning if the detection system works correctly and the alert reaches devices quickly enough. A coastal town sitting directly above or adjacent to the locked zone gets seconds, or in some cases, almost nothing. Shake Alert's operational performance has been validated during real earthquakes. During a magnitude 4.5 earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area in 2023, the system delivered alerts to mobile phones before the shaking arrived for users several miles from the epicenter. The technology works. The challenge is the physics, which cannot be changed, and the gaps in offshore sensor coverage, which can be improved with investment. For a Cascadia rupture beginning on the fault 50 miles offshore, the sequence would look roughly like this. The rupture starts. Seafloor sensors, if positioned near the rupture zone, detect the first seismic waves within seconds. The Shake Alert system calculates magnitude and location. Alerts are sent. The shaking front is already moving toward the coast at several miles per second. Communities 10 to 20 miles inland from the coast receive perhaps 10 to 20 seconds of warning. Portland, roughly 70 miles from the coast, might receive 30 to 50 seconds. Seattle, further north and east, could receive a longer window. Those numbers assume the offshore sensor network detects the rupture quickly, and the alert reaches phones and automated systems without delay. Scientists working on network improvements are direct about the current limitation. The offshore portion of the Cascadia monitoring network remains the weakest link, and filling that gap requires ocean floor sensor installations in deep water, far from shore, a technically demanding and expensive undertaking that is underway but incomplete. What those seconds enable, even in the best case, matters enormously. Drop, cover, and hold on is one of the most effective individual survival actions for a person inside a building during strong shaking. Automatic shutoffs for gas lines prevent fires that would otherwise start in ruptured systems and spread through damaged neighborhoods. Trains stopped before the shaking arrives avoid derailments. These are outcomes that seconds of warning directly produce. But warning time is one element of a system whose other components must also function. After the shaking stops, the warning system's job is done. What comes next is governed by how well the physical infrastructure surrounding each community has been built, retrofitted, and maintained. For much of the Pacific Northwest, that infrastructure assessment is still being written, and the pace of improvement is running against a clock whose alarm time remains unknown. The gap between what the science shows is coming and what the built environment is prepared to survive is the central question that scientists are now, quietly and with increasing urgency, beginning to state in public. In the vocabulary of earthquake engineering, there is a category of structure that appears safe from the outside and fails catastrophically when the ground moves. These buildings fill entire city blocks in the Pacific Northwest. They house offices, apartments, retail shops, and restaurants. Many are in historic districts. Some are beloved neighborhood landmarks. Structurally, they are among the most dangerous occupied buildings in the United States during a major earthquake. Unreinforced masonry buildings, constructed of brick, stone, or concrete block, without internal steel reinforcement, behave in a specific and well-documented way during seismic shaking. Masonry materials are strong in compression, meaning they can bear tremendous vertical load. They are weak in tension and shear, meaning they cannot flex or absorb the lateral forces that earthquake waves produce. When strong shaking arrives, the walls move differently from the floors and roof above them. The connections between them, lacking steel reinforcement to bridge that gap, fail. Walls collapse outward. Roofs drop. The occupants inside have essentially no warning that the structure is failing until it already has. Engineers have understood this failure mode since at least the 1971 Silmar earthquake in California, which destroyed multiple unreinforced masonry buildings. The 1980 Loma Prieta earthquake reinforced the lesson. The 1994 Northridge earthquake reinforced it again. International examples, including the 1988 Spitak earthquake in Armenia and the 2010 Haiti earthquake, showed what happens at scale when an urban area contains a large proportion of unreinforced masonry. The death tolls in those events were dominated by building collapses, and the collapsed buildings were disproportionately masonry. California responded to this documented pattern with legislation. Following Loma Prieta and Northridge, California cities implemented mandatory retrofit programs for their most vulnerable unreinforced masonry buildings. Los Angeles alone identified and required retrofitting of thousands of such structures. The process took decades, cost billions, and reduced the expected death toll in future major earthquakes by a measurable and significant margin. Oregon and Washington have taken steps in this direction, but at a slower pace and without statewide mandatory retrofit laws. Comparable to California's, Portland has catalogued its unreinforced masonry buildings, and in recent years has made progress on prioritizing the most dangerous structures for retrofit or demolition. Seattle has done the same. But the inventory of vulnerable buildings in both cities remains large, and the economic challenge of retrofit is real. Many of these buildings are owned by small landlords or businesses operating on narrow margins who cannot self-fund major structural improvements. The concentration of unreinforced masonry in certain neighborhoods also means the risk is unevenly distributed across these cities. Historic commercial districts, older residential neighborhoods close to city centers, and industrial areas with legacy warehouse buildings all carry elevated collapse risk. A major earthquake affecting these zones would produce a pattern of damage that is geographically concentrated, but individually catastrophic for every person inside a failing structure. Alongside unreinforced masonry, engineers have also identified a category of concrete building designed and built before modern seismic codes came into force. These non-ductile concrete buildings contain reinforcing steel, but it was installed in a configuration that does not allow the structure to flex and absorb energy effectively. Under strong shaking, these buildings can fail suddenly and completely. Several Pacific Northwest cities contain significant numbers of these structures, including public buildings, schools, and residential apartments. The effort to identify, assess, and address them is ongoing, and the timeline for completion runs into years and decades, rather than months. Every year, the inventory of vulnerable buildings remains unchanged. The risk inside those walls accumulates alongside the stress in the fault below. In June of 2016, emergency management agencies across the Pacific Northwest conducted the largest earthquake preparedness exercise in United States history. The exercise was called Cascadia Rising. It involved thousands of participants across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia, including military personnel, state and local emergency managers, hospital systems, utility operators, and volunteer organizations. The scenario they simulated was a full magnitude 9 Cascadia rupture, the kind of event the geological record shows has happened before and will happen again. The findings from Cascadia Rising were documented and released publicly. They were not optimistic. Within the first 72 hours of the simulated event, the exercise revealed a consistent pattern of cascading failures. Coastal communities in Oregon and Washington were cut off from outside assistance by destroyed and impassable roads and bridges. The volume of debris from collapsed structures and landslides blocked major highways. The primary Interstate 5 corridor connecting Oregon's cities north to south suffered multiple simulated bridge failures that severed ground transportation links for extended periods. Hospital capacity emerged as one of the most critical gaps. The exercise projected that a major Cascadia event would generate tens of thousands of injuries, requiring medical attention simultaneously across a geographic region spanning hundreds of miles. The combined hospital capacity of the affected states, even accounting for surge capacity and emergency field hospitals, was assessed as dramatically insufficient for the scale of need. Trauma centers closest to the highest damage zones were simultaneously the most likely to be damaged or inaccessible themselves. Communication systems showed significant vulnerabilities. Cell towers, which rely on commercial power and battery backup systems with limited duration, were projected to fail across large portions of the affected region within hours. Emergency radio networks, intended as the backup system, revealed coverage gaps and coordination problems under the simulated stress of a multi-state event with simultaneous demands on limited frequencies. Fuel supply presented a separate crisis within the crisis. The exercise found that the Pacific Northwest's fuel supply infrastructure, concentrated in a small number of marine terminals and pipeline facilities in vulnerable locations, would be disrupted in ways that constrained every other response function. Emergency generators, rescue vehicles, helicopters, and hospital backup systems all compete for fuel from the same disrupted supply chain. The exercise did not produce a clean resolution to this problem within the simulated timeframe. Search and rescue capacity, while significantly more developed than it was before programs like the Urban Search and Rescue System were established, was still found to be inadequate for the scale of simultaneous collapse events projected across the region. Teams would face the triage challenge of choosing which collapsed structures to prioritize when the number of sites exceeded the available personnel and equipment by a large margin. The overall picture that emerged from Cascadia Rising was of a disaster that would overwhelm the existing response capacity of local, state, and federal agencies for a sustained period, potentially weeks to months in the most severely affected coastal communities. That assessment has driven subsequent investment in preparedness, but emergency managers who participated in the exercise are direct about the gap that remains. The exercise showed what is needed. What followed has been meaningful progress that still falls well short of the scale the scenario demands. The physical systems designed to hold cities together when the ground moves are one major piece of that gap. The maps exist. State geological surveys in Oregon and Washington have produced detailed liquefaction susceptibility maps for major urban areas, showing block by block in some cases which areas of each city sit on ground likely to behave like liquid during strong shaking. These maps are publicly accessible. Emergency planners, engineers, and city officials use them regularly. They also reveal something uncomfortable about where the highest concentration of people, critical infrastructure, and economic activity tends to sit in Pacific Northwest cities. Portland's liquefaction hazard maps show that the areas of highest susceptibility include the riverfront industrial zones along the Willamette, the floodplain neighborhoods north of the city center, and the low-lying areas adjacent to several of the city's major bridges. These are also areas that contain fuel terminals, warehouses, freight operations, a large convention center, and the primary rail and road connections to the ports. In a major earthquake, the ground beneath these areas would experience lateral spreading, where liquefied soil flows toward riverbanks and low points, shearing apart anything built on or in it. Seattle's maps show a similar pattern. The Duwamish River Valley, running south through the industrial district toward the port, sits on fill and alluvial soil that scores highly on susceptibility indices. The areas around Elliott Bay's southern end, beneath some of the city's major event venues and industrial infrastructure, carry elevated risk. Portions of the waterfront that were built on piling foundations driven through fill into deeper soil carry somewhat lower risk, but the ground between those structures remains vulnerable. What makes the liquefaction maps particularly useful for emergency planners is that they allow pre-disaster modeling of which roads will likely become impassable, which utility corridors will likely rupture, and which neighborhoods will be most isolated in the hours after a major earthquake. That modeling informs decisions about where to pre-position emergency supplies, which routes to designate as primary evacuation and resupply corridors, and which areas to prioritize for early search and rescue. The maps also reveal a gap between scientific knowledge and public awareness. Most people living and working in high susceptibility zones have never seen these maps and have no working understanding of what liquefaction is or what it would mean for their street, their building, or their neighborhood. Public education campaigns exist, but their reach is limited against the scale of the population that needs to understand this risk. One specific implication of the liquefaction maps concerns underground infrastructure. Water, sewer, gas, and communications lines all run beneath city streets in trenches through the same susceptible soils. When those soils liquefy, buried pipes and conduits experience the same lateral ground movement and settlement that damages surface roads and foundations. The result is a pattern of breakage distributed across entire neighborhoods simultaneously, affecting water supply, natural gas distribution, and telecommunications all at once. Restoring these systems after a major event requires physical excavation and replacement in ground that may still be unstable, a process that takes months in the best-case scenarios from comparable events. The maps do not eliminate the hazard. They describe it with precision. Acting on them through infrastructure upgrades, adjusted emergency planning, and better designed new construction is the work that transforms scientific knowledge into reduced casualties. That work is advancing, but the distance between where it stands today and what the maps indicate is needed remains one of the central concerns in every serious earthquake preparedness conversation happening in the Pacific Northwest right now. The ground beneath the cities tells one part of the story. What sits on top of that ground and how it has been built tells another, and the two stories combine into a picture of risk that is considerably more detailed than most people living inside it have ever been shown. When seismologists and probabilistic hazard analysts discuss Cascadia, they work within a framework that the public often finds either more alarming or less alarming than the actual science warrants. The challenge is that earthquake probability is expressed in ways that feel counterintuitive. A 10% chance over 50 years sounds like a low number. Placed in context, it describes a risk level that drives major policy decisions in every other domain of public safety. The probability estimates for Cascadia rupture come from multiple independent lines of evidence, each of which informs a different component of the calculation. Paleoseismic records provide the historical recurrence interval. How often, on average, has the fault produced a major rupture over the past several thousand years? GPS and geodetic measurements provide the strain accumulation rate. How fast is energy building in the locked zone today? Fault geometry and mechanical models provide estimates of how much rupture can be expected given the measured strain. Combined, these inputs feed into probabilistic seismic hazard analyses that produce the estimates emergency planners and engineers use to design response systems. The United States Geological Survey's National Seismic Hazard Models incorporate all of this evidence and express it as the probability of exceeding a certain level of ground shaking at any given location over a specified time period, typically 50 years, which corresponds roughly to the design life of a building. For communities along the Pacific Northwest coast, those models place Cascadia-related hazard in the upper tier of seismic risk anywhere in the continental United States. For the probability of a full margin rupture, meaning the entire 700 miles breaking in a single event, estimates from various research groups have generally ranged from roughly 10 to 15% in the next 50 years. The probability of a significant partial rupture, affecting a portion of the fault and still capable of producing a magnitude 8 or greater earthquake, is estimated higher. These numbers are not certainties. They carry uncertainty ranges that reflect the relatively short instrumental record and the variability in the paleoseismic data. But they are also based on extensive evidence and peer-reviewed analysis, and they have been stable across multiple independent modeling efforts. What changes how these probabilities should be understood is the magnitude of the consequence at the end of the probability. A 10% chance of an event that would produce thousands of deaths, hundreds of billions of dollars in damage, and displace over 1 million people is categorically different from a 10% chance of a moderate flood or a minor storm. In risk management, consequence scales the meaning of probability. The same probability attached to a larger consequence demands a proportionally larger response. The probabilistic hazard framework also produces something emergency planners specifically care about: return period estimates. The inverse of an annual probability of occurrence, the return period for a full Cascadia rupture, is estimated in the range of several hundred years, consistent with the paleoseismic record. But that return period describes an average, not a countdown. The fault does not reset its clock after each rupture. The 325 years since 1700 tells geologists that significant stored energy exists. It does not tell them when the release comes. Scientists who work on Cascadia communicate this distinction carefully in public. The numbers they use are tools for planning, not predictions. But the fact that those scientists are now speaking more openly about the risk level, more publicly and more urgently than they did even a decade ago, carries its own signal about how the internal assessment has shifted. A single major rupture rarely ends the seismic story it starts. The energy released by a large earthquake does not simply dissipate into the surrounding rock. It redistributes. It pushes stress onto adjacent fault sections, onto nearby fault systems, and onto areas of the crust that were already accumulating their own loading. The science of how one earthquake changes the probability of others nearby is called Coulomb stress transfer, and its implications for the Pacific Northwest extend well beyond Cascadia itself. The basic mechanism works like this. When one section of a fault breaks, the rocks on either side of the rupture shift position. That repositioning changes the stress field in the surrounding crust. Some areas of rock experience an increase in the forces pushing them toward failure. Other areas experience a decrease. Seismologists can calculate these stress changes using fault geometry, rupture models, and the known mechanical properties of the crust in the region. After major earthquakes, the Coulomb stress transfer model has been used to explain patterns of aftershock distribution, and in some cases, to identify faults that experienced increased loading from the main event. Following the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, researchers found that the rupture had measurably altered stress conditions on faults across a wide region. Some of those faults became more active in the months and years after the main event, consistent with the stress transfer model's predictions. In the Cascadia context, a full margin rupture would transfer stress onto several nearby fault systems. The Seattle Fault, already identified as capable of producing a magnitude 7 or greater earthquake, sits in a position where a Cascadia event would alter the stress conditions acting on it. The exact effect depends on the precise rupture geometry of the Cascadia event, which varies across different models, but the principle that a major rupture modifies the stress environment of nearby faults is well established. The same applies to other fault systems in the region: the South Whidbey Island Fault, the Tacoma Fault, and various unnamed or partially characterized fault structures across the Puget Sound region, all sit within the area that a Cascadia rupture would affect through stress transfer. The practical implication is that a major Cascadia event would arrive with aftershocks, as all major earthquakes do, and that some of those aftershocks could be substantial, occurring on nearby faults that experienced stress loading from the main rupture. Emergency response planning must account for this. A major aftershock arriving hours or days after the initial Cascadia rupture, at a moment when emergency personnel are deployed in damaged buildings and infrastructure is already compromised, would add casualties and damage to an already overwhelmed response system. Structures that survived the main event but were weakened by it could fail in a significant aftershock. Roads cleared after the main rupture could be blocked again. The stress transfer model also has a sobering long-term dimension. Historical records and paleoseismic data from other major subduction zones show that large earthquakes sometimes trigger significant events on nearby fault systems months to years afterward. In the decades following a major Cascadia rupture, researchers would closely monitor the stress-loaded sections of the regional fault network. The period immediately after the first major event would be, in important ways, a period of elevated risk rather than a return to normal. That longer view of how seismic systems behave over time is one of the reasons scientists studying Cascadia speak carefully about what a rupture would mean. The event itself would be devastating. What follows it carries its own dimensions that are still being studied, still being modeled, and still being integrated into the preparedness plans that the Pacific Northwest is quietly and urgently building. For most of the 20th century, the Cascadia Subduction Zone was poorly understood. Until the 1980s, many geologists working in the Pacific Northwest did not believe the fault was capable of producing a great earthquake at all. The region lacked historical records of a major event, because the last full rupture, in 1700, predated Euro-American settlement. Indigenous oral traditions from Pacific Northwest communities described catastrophic flooding and ground shaking from distant memory, but those accounts were not integrated into the geological record that scientists were building. The discovery that changed the assessment was methodical. Beginning in the 1980s, researchers applying paleoseismic techniques to coastal marshes, lake beds, and offshore sediment cores began finding the buried evidence of repeated massive ruptures. Each new site confirmed and extended the picture. By the 1990s, the scientific consensus had shifted decisively. Cascadia produces magnitude 8 and 9 earthquakes on a cycle measured in centuries, and it had done so repeatedly. The public communication of that finding was initially cautious. Scientists described the hazard in technical language, in papers and at conferences, and in briefings to government agencies. The message reached emergency planners and eventually produced the first generation of Cascadia-specific preparedness efforts. But the tone of the scientific communication to the broader public remained measured, careful, and by the standard of what the science actually showed, somewhat understated. That tone has shifted in the last decade. The shift has several causes, each of which reflects a change in the scientific understanding or the broader preparedness context. Tohoku was the first major accelerant. Watching a nation with Japan's level of seismic preparation absorb a magnitude 9 subduction zone earthquake and still experience nearly 20,000 deaths, complete infrastructure failure across hundreds of miles of coastline, and cascading nuclear system failures made the Pacific Northwest risk feel less abstract and more imminent. Researchers, who had been describing Cascadia's potential in probabilistic terms, began speaking more concretely about what the prepared and unprepared scenarios actually look like for specific communities. The second accelerant was data. The expansion of GPS networks, the deployment of offshore seismometers, the growing catalogue of slow slip events, and the refinement of probabilistic hazard models have all increased the resolution with which scientists can describe the Cascadia threat. Better data does not mean more danger. The fault was always this dangerous. Better data means the description of that danger is now more specific, more granular, and harder to speak about vaguely. The third factor is demographic. The Pacific Northwest has grown substantially in the decades since Cascadia's hazard was first characterized. More people live in the highest risk zones today than at any previous point in recorded history. The coastal population has increased. The urban population in Portland and Seattle has grown. The number of people who would be affected by a full Cascadia rupture is larger than the scientific community was calibrating to in the 1990s. The combination of these three factors has produced a noticeable shift in how seismologists, geophysicists, and emergency planners communicate publicly. Scientific papers on Cascadia now routinely include plain language summaries aimed at policy audiences. State geological surveys have released updated hazard assessments written for general readership. Researchers who previously confined their strongest statements to peer-reviewed literature have become more willing to state directly, in public forums, that the Pacific Northwest is not prepared for the event the geological record guarantees will eventually arrive. That shift in tone is its own signal. When the people who spend their careers studying a threat begin speaking more urgently about it, the question worth asking is what they are seeing in the data that is driving that change. The answer, in the case of Cascadia, involves the specific pattern of what the fault has been doing in recent years, and what that pattern may indicate about the stress state of a system that has been building toward its next great release for over 3 centuries. 15 minutes. That is the estimated arrival time of the first tsunami wave at some Oregon coastal communities following a full Cascadia rupture. 15 minutes from the moment the ground stops shaking to the moment the ocean arrives. For people standing on flat coastal land with no high ground within walking distance, that window is the entire margin between survival and catastrophe. The geography of the Pacific Northwest coast makes this problem acute in ways that differ from other tsunami-prone regions. Much of the Oregon and Washington coastline consists of low-lying beach communities, river-mouth towns, and estuary settlements surrounded by flat terrain. The nearest naturally elevated ground may be half a mile away or more. For elderly residents, people with mobility limitations, families with young children, or anyone whose car is blocked by post-earthquake debris, half a mile in 15 minutes is a race many will not win. The engineering response to this problem is called vertical evacuation. The concept is straightforward. Build a reinforced structure tall enough and strong enough to survive both the earthquake shaking and the tsunami inundation, and position it close enough to the highest risk population that people can reach it on foot within the available warning time. When the ground shakes, instead of running toward distant hills, coastal residents run to the nearest vertical evacuation structure and climb. Japan adopted this approach aggressively after 2011. Coastal communities along the Tohoku coast built elevated refuge platforms, reinforced berms, and tsunami-resistant towers, specifically designed to serve as refuge points for residents who could not escape to high ground before waves arrived. Some of these structures are incorporated into existing buildings. Others are purpose-built refuges. All are designed to the specific inundation height projected for their location based on modeling of worst-case tsunami scenarios. In the Pacific Northwest, vertical evacuation has moved from concept to implementation, but the number of completed structures remains a fraction of what planners say is needed. Tokeland, Washington, completed a vertical evacuation structure. Cannon Beach, Oregon, built an elevated refuge into a new community building. Several other communities have structures in various stages of planning or construction. The challenge is funding. Purpose-built tsunami refuge structures are expensive relative to the budget of small coastal municipalities, and federal funding streams for this specific type of infrastructure have been limited and inconsistent. The gap between the number of completed structures and the number needed to give every coastal resident in a high-risk zone a viable survival option is significant. Researchers who have modeled the population in highest-risk inundation zones against the capacity of existing and planned vertical evacuation structures find that a large portion of the at-risk population in the most vulnerable communities still lacks a reachable refuge within the available time window. Oregon and Washington have both produced statewide plans that identify priority communities for vertical evacuation investment and outline the funding and construction timelines needed to close the gap. Those plans describe an achievable path. The pace of progress along that path depends on sustained funding commitments that have not yet fully materialized at the state or federal level. The 15-minute window is fixed by physics. The distance to safety is fixed by geography. The only variable that human decision-making controls is whether the structures are built before the rupture comes. Every community that completes a vertical evacuation structure before the next Cascadia event converts a certain tragedy into a survivable scenario for the people who reach it. Every community that does not complete one is relying on a race against a clock that the ocean always wins. The communities that have confronted this most directly are the ones now asking a harder question: whether warning systems, evacuation routes, and refuge structures are enough, or whether the real answer requires rethinking where people live and work on the coast altogether. In 2013, a team of engineers, scientists, emergency managers, and policy experts delivered a report to the Oregon legislature that described in detail what a full Cascadia earthquake would do to the state. The document was called the Oregon Resilience Plan. It was the result of years of work by dozens of specialists across multiple disciplines. Its findings were not theoretical. They were grounded in engineering assessments of real infrastructure, real building inventories, and real emergency response capacity measured against a real modeled earthquake scenario. The report described a Cascadia rupture producing shaking that would last several minutes across the entire state. It projected that the Willamette Valley, home to the majority of Oregon's population, would experience severe to violent shaking levels across wide areas. It estimated that thousands of buildings would be damaged or destroyed. It projected that the majority of Oregon's highway bridges would sustain damage, with a significant percentage suffering damage severe enough to close them to traffic. It estimated weeks to months before major transportation routes could be restored. For the coast specifically, the picture was more severe. The report estimated that coastal communities would lose all ground transportation access for an extended period. Fuel, food, medical supplies, and emergency personnel would be unable to reach coastal areas by road. The communities that survived the initial shaking and tsunami would be effectively isolated. dependent on air and sea logistics, that themselves would be constrained by infrastructure damage and operational limitations. The water system projections were among the most concrete. The report estimated that the majority of water system pipes in Oregon's major cities would be damaged in a full Cascadia event. Restoring water service to most of the affected population was projected to take months. Without running water, fire suppression becomes impossible in most of the city. Sanitation collapses. Disease risk rises. Hospitals that require large volumes of water for basic operations cannot function. The report put forward a set of recommendations for what it would take to make Oregon resilient to a Cascadia earthquake within 50 years. The projected cost was in the tens of billions of dollars, covering bridge retrofits, water system improvements, hospital upgrades, coastal evacuation infrastructure, and emergency supply pre-positioning. The timeline was explicitly stated as 50 years of sustained investment, not a single budget cycle. Since 2013, Oregon has made measurable progress on some of the report's priorities. Bridge assessments have advanced. Hospital seismic standards have been updated for some facilities. Public awareness has grown. Emergency planning has incorporated more of the scenario's specific findings. But independent assessments of progress against the Oregon Resilience Plan's recommendations consistently find that the pace of implementation falls well short of what the report identified as necessary to achieve meaningful resilience within the projected rupture window. The report's authors were clear about the intent of publishing a document with findings this serious. They wanted elected officials and the public to understand what the science actually shows, expressed in terms of specific infrastructure, specific timelines, and specific costs, rather than in the probabilistic language of seismic hazard assessments that few people outside the technical community fully translate into human terms. What the report accomplished was creating a shared factual baseline for the preparedness conversation in Oregon. The gap between that baseline and the current state of preparation is measurable. It is also, as the report's authors intended, a gap that is entirely within human capacity to close, given sufficient time and sustained commitment. The time remaining before the next Cascadia rupture is unknown. The commitment required is not. While Cascadia dominates the conversation about Pacific Northwest earthquake risk, a separate fault system, 400 miles to the south, runs its own independent clock toward a major rupture that seismologists describe as equally overdue. The Hayward Fault cuts directly through the eastern side of the San Francisco Bay Area, running beneath the cities of Oakland, Berkeley, Hayward, Fremont, and San Jose for roughly 70 miles. More than 2 million people live within a few miles of its trace. Several major hospitals, university campuses, highways, and water supply infrastructure sit directly on or immediately adjacent to the fault. The Hayward Fault last ruptured in October of 1868, producing a magnitude 6.8 to 7 earthquake that destroyed much of downtown Hayward and was felt across most of California. At the time, the Bay Area's population was a small fraction of what it is today. The death toll was relatively limited because so few people lived in the affected area. The same earthquake occurring today, with the current population and the current building stock, would produce a fundamentally different outcome. Geologists have established the Hayward Fault's recurrence interval through paleoseismic investigation. Trenching across the fault at multiple sites has revealed evidence of past ruptures in the soil, including offset layers and buried organic material that can be radiocarbon dated. The average interval between major Hayward ruptures is estimated at roughly 140 to 160 years. The time since 1868 is now approaching 160 years. That interval places the Hayward Fault inside or past its average recurrence window, though researchers apply the same caution to this statement that they apply to Cascadia. Fault recurrence intervals are averages drawn from a limited historical sample. The next rupture could come before the average interval is reached, or significantly after it. What the interval tells scientists is that the fault has built up stress consistent with what past ruptures have required to break through, and that the probability of rupture is elevated relative to faults with much longer recurrence cycles. The Hayward Fault also exhibits a form of slow creep along portions of its length, where the fault moves slightly and continuously at the surface, a few millimeters per year. This creep does not represent the full plate motion being accommodated. and it does not prevent a major rupture. It complicates the stress picture by partially releasing stress on some segments while other segments remain locked. The sections of the fault that are not creeping are the sections that accumulate the stored elastic energy that eventually releases in a major earthquake. A major Hayward rupture was modeled in detail by the United States Geological Survey in a scenario called the Hayward earthquake scenario, published in 2018. That scenario modeled a magnitude 7 earthquake on the Hayward Fault and projected over 800 deaths, more than $400 billion in economic losses, and major disruptions to water, power, transportation, and communications infrastructure across the Bay Area. The scenario specifically examined what happens when a modern major metro area with significant infrastructure dependencies experiences a long-duration disruption. The Bay Area and the Pacific Northwest present different versions of the same fundamental problem. Both regions sit above fault systems that are measurably loaded and historically active. Both have populations, infrastructure concentrations, and economic systems that were built with incomplete awareness of the seismic environment. Both now have detailed scientific assessments that describe the risk with precision. The gap between that scientific precision and the physical state of preparation is what earthquake researchers in both regions are increasingly describing in public with less restraint than they once felt was appropriate. Two buildings, constructed to identical standards, standing 2 miles apart in the same city, experience fundamentally different shaking during the same earthquake. One survives with minimal damage, the other collapses. The difference has nothing to do with their design, and everything to do with what is beneath their foundations. Seismic waves traveling through different materials change character as they move. When a wave transitions from hard bedrock into soft sediment, it slows down. Physics requires that the energy carried by the wave be conserved as its speed decreases, so the amplitude of the wave increases. The shaking becomes more intense, lasts longer, and in some cases becomes tuned to a specific frequency that can resonate with and amplify damage to certain building types. This is called soil amplification, and its effects in real earthquakes have been measured and documented with precision. The most famous single demonstration of soil amplification in United States earthquake history occurred during the 1980 Loma Prieta earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area. The earthquake originated roughly 60 miles from San Francisco. Ground motion measurements across the city showed that areas built on bedrock experienced significantly lower shaking than areas built on the loose bay fill and soft sediment of the Marina District and parts of the Embarcadero. The Marina District, despite its distance from the epicenter, suffered disproportionate damage, including building collapses and fires from ruptured gas lines, while bedrock neighborhoods much closer to the epicenter had comparatively minor damage. That documented pattern from Loma Prieta maps almost precisely onto the conditions that exist across Pacific Northwest cities. Geologic surveys of Portland and Seattle identified distinct zones of soft sediment, formal wetlands, river deposits, and artificial fill that sit alongside bedrock ridges and hills. During a major earthquake, those soft zones will experience shaking that is measurably more intense and longer in duration than the bedrock areas nearby. The difference in ground motion between the best and worst soil sites in a city like Portland during a major Cascadia earthquake could be a factor of several times, meaning some neighborhoods experience shaking that is several times more intense than others even within the same metropolitan area. This has direct implications for building performance. Tall and mid-rise buildings have natural resonant frequencies that, when they match the dominant frequency of amplified seismic waves, can experience dramatically increased forces on their structural systems. Soft soil sites tend to produce shaking with lower frequencies that match the resonant behavior of taller structures. This is one reason why some major earthquakes have caused selective damage to buildings of a particular height range on soft soils, while leaving shorter or taller buildings relatively intact. Emergency planners and seismic engineers use soil amplification maps to identify which neighborhoods face the highest combined risk of both intense shaking and building vulnerability. Where soft soils coincide with concentrations of older or unreinforced buildings, the risk is multiplicative. The two hazards compound each other. and the result is pockets of the city where the expected damage is dramatically higher than the citywide average. The amplification maps also inform decisions about where to place emergency response infrastructure. Hospitals, fire stations, emergency operations centers, and communication facilities positioned on soft soil face higher shaking intensity and higher failure probability than the same facilities positioned on rock. Relocating critical infrastructure to better ground is expensive and often impractical in the short term. But accounting for soil conditions in every new construction decision is one of the simplest and most cost-effective risk reduction tools available, and it carries no cost beyond the choice of where to build. The evidence for Cascadia's violent past does not come only from coastal marshes and drowned forests. Some of the most precise and technically demanding work in this field happens inland, across fault zones where teams of geoscientists dig long, narrow trenches through the soil, expose the walls of sediment layer by layer, and read the record of past earthquakes written in offset, broken, and disrupted ground. Paleoseismology through trenching works because earthquakes leave physical traces in the earth that persist for thousands of years under the right conditions. When a fault ruptures and the ground on either side shifts, sediment layers that were once horizontal become offset. Layers that were once continuous are broken and displaced. In some cases, the surface rupture collapses the soil above it into a scar or a depression that gradually fills with new sediment over time, preserving the event horizon as a sharp boundary that geologists can identify, measure, and date. Trenching studies across the Seattle Fault have revealed the physical evidence of past major earthquakes in extraordinary detail. At sites along Puget Sound and inland near the fault's eastern reaches, researchers have found offset sediment layers, disrupted bedding, and buried colluvial wedges, the distinctive wedge-shaped deposits of collapsed material that accumulate at the base of fault scarps after a rupture. Radiocarbon dating of organic material trapped in these layers allows scientists to constrain the timing of past events to within decades in some cases, and within a century or two in others. The trenching data confirms what coastal evidence suggests. The Seattle Fault produced a major rupture roughly 1,100 years ago. The rupture was large enough to offset the ground surface by several feet, thrust sections of shoreline upward, and trigger the landslide into Lake Washington documented independently by lake sediment cores. Multiple independent lines of evidence from entirely different locations converge on the same event. That convergence is the scientific bedrock of the hazard assessment. Trenching on the Hayward Fault in California has produced one of the longest and most detailed paleoseismic records of any fault system in the United States. At the Tyson Lagoon site in Fremont, researchers documented the record of multiple past ruptures through careful excavation and analysis of displaced soil layers and radiocarbon-dated organic material. That record established the recurrence interval, confirmed the 1,700-year record of repeated failure, and provided the basis for the probability estimates now used in Bay Area hazard planning. The trenching method has limitations. It requires that the fault ruptures the surface or near surface, which not all faults do. It requires preservation of the stratigraphic record, which can be destroyed by erosion, human development, or bioturbation, and it captures only events large enough to produce a recognizable surface signature, potentially missing smaller events in the historical sequence. Despite those limitations, trenching remains one of the most powerful tools in the paleoseismologist's kit because it deals directly with physical reality. The offset layers in a trench wall are not models or calculations. They are the actual ground that moved during an actual earthquake, at an actual point in time. When multiple trench sites across a fault system tell a consistent story about rupture timing, magnitude, and recurrence, that story carries a kind of authority that no computational model alone can match. The story that the Cascadia area trenches tell, read alongside the coastal evidence and the offshore sediment cores, is one of a fault system that operates on geological timescales, but produces human-scale catastrophes. It has done so repeatedly, predictably, and without regard for whether the cities above it were ready. In the years following March 2011, Japan undertook the largest coastal infrastructure reconstruction effort in the nation's history. The scale of what was built, the speed at which it was built, and the ongoing debate about whether it was built the right way all carry direct lessons for every coastal region living under a subduction zone threat, including the Pacific Northwest. The centerpiece of Japan's post-Tohoku coastal defense strategy was a seawall construction program that ultimately stretched for hundreds of miles along the Tohoku coastline. Many sections reached heights of nearly 40 feet. Some communities received walls taller than a 4-story building running along their entire waterfront. The total cost of this infrastructure, combined with the broader reconstruction program, reached into hundreds of billions of dollars, funded by the Japanese national government through a combination of emergency budgets and reconstruction bonds. The engineering rationale was direct. Design the seawalls to withstand a tsunami equivalent to the most frequent class of Tohoku-type events, accepting that an extreme event like the 2011 tsunami would overtop them, while still reducing the damage from smaller but more regular tsunami threats. The walls were never designed to be an absolute barrier against the worst possible scenario. They were designed to buy time and reduce inundation for moderate events, while preserving the obligation for residents to evacuate in a major earthquake. The reconstruction debate that followed in Japan was substantial and continues. Some coastal communities embraced the seawalls as essential protection and rebuilt below them. Other communities, particularly in areas that experienced the most devastating losses, chose to relocate entire town centers to higher ground. Minami Sanreku, which lost roughly 60% of its population, rebuilt its commercial core on an elevated platform above the floodplain, essentially lifting the town out of the tsunami zone rather than building a barrier to keep the water out. The relocation approach is considered more fundamentally safe by many researchers because it removes people from the inundation zone permanently, rather than depending on a structure that can be overtopped or damaged. But relocation is enormously disruptive, economically costly, and deeply unpopular with residents who have historic ties to specific locations. In Japan, the choice between walls and relocation played out differently in each community, driven by local political decisions, resident preferences, and the specific geography of each site. For the Pacific Northwest, the Japanese experience offers both a template and a caution. The template is that comprehensive coastal seismic and tsunami preparedness is achievable and has been done. The caution is that even Japan, with its resources, national commitment, and decades of prior preparation, was overwhelmed by a rupture that exceeded the prevailing models. And the financial scale of Japan's response is far beyond what Oregon and Washington municipalities, or even the two states combined, could mobilize without sustained federal engagement at a level not currently established. The gap between Japan's post-Tohoku response and the Pacific Northwest's current preparedness trajectory is not a gap in scientific understanding. Both regions know what the threat is. The gap is in the political and financial commitment to act on that knowledge, at the scale and pace the science demands. Every year that gap persists, the Cascadia Fault continues building the pressure it has been accumulating since 1700, indifferent to the pace of the construction schedules above it. Understanding what a fault is doing in real time requires instruments placed as close to the fault as possible. For the Cascadia Subduction Zone, that means the ocean floor. The locked zone where the next major rupture will begin sits beneath several miles of ocean water, tens of miles offshore, in one of the most logistically challenging environments on Earth for instrument deployment and maintenance. Getting sensors to that environment and keeping them running is technically demanding, expensive, and absolutely necessary for the detection and warning system to function at its best. The Ocean Observatories Initiative, a major National Science Foundation-funded program, operates a network of instrumented seafloor nodes off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, specifically designed to monitor the Cascadia fault system in real time. These nodes are cabled to shore, meaning they transmit data continuously through fiber optic cables, rather than relying on acoustic telemetry or battery-powered floats. Cabled observatories provide the low-latency, high-bandwidth data connection that real-time earthquake monitoring requires. A sensor that stores data locally and uploads it periodically is useful for research. A sensor that transmits every second to a processing center on shore is what an early warning system needs. The Cascadia seafloor network includes seismometers that detect ground motion on the ocean floor, pressure sensors that measure changes in water column height caused by seafloor deformation, and instruments that monitor temperature, chemistry, and other parameters relevant to the broader research program on the fault. The combination of seismic and pressure data from seafloor sensors positioned near the fault can detect a rupture within seconds of it beginning, and transmit that detection to shore-based processing systems faster than the seismic waves themselves travel to coastal communities. The current offshore network, while substantially more capable than what existed a decade ago, still has geographic gaps. The Cascadia Fault stretches 700 miles, and the cabled observatory infrastructure covers a portion of that length. Areas along the southern and northern ends of the fault have less offshore sensor coverage than the central segments. Expanding coverage to the full fault length would require additional cabling, additional seafloor nodes, and the ship time and engineering resources to deploy and maintain them. The importance of closing those gaps is directly tied to warning time. A rupture that begins in a section of the fault not covered by nearby offshore sensors takes longer to detect and characterize, which reduces the warning time available to coastal communities before the shaking arrives. For communities already working with warning windows of 15 minutes or less, any reduction in detection time compounds the exposure. Research teams from universities across the Pacific Northwest, in collaboration with government agencies, are actively working to expand the offshore monitoring capability. Proposals for additional seafloor sensors, improved real-time data processing, and integration of offshore data with the shake alert warning system are in various stages of development and funding pursuit. The scientific community is clear about the goal: a sensor network dense enough that any rupture along the full length of the Cascadia Fault is detected and characterized within seconds of beginning, regardless of where along the fault it starts. The offshore network also serves a long-term scientific purpose that extends beyond warning. Continuous seafloor monitoring records the full behavior of the fault between major earthquakes, including slow slip events, tremor activity, and any anomalous deformation that might precede a larger rupture. That long-term record, built year by year as the network operates, is the data foundation on which the next generation of Cascadia hazard models will be built. When the public discussion of Cascadia earthquake consequences focuses on tsunamis, it concentrates almost entirely on coastal inundation. That focus is appropriate given the scale and speed of the coastal threat. But a significant and underappreciated secondary hazard exists well inland, one that would affect communities far beyond the tsunami inundation zone and compound the recovery challenge across the entire region for months. Major earthquakes trigger landslides. The relationship between strong seismic shaking and slope failure is well documented across dozens of large events worldwide. Slopes that are stable under static conditions, where water, gravity, and soil cohesion are in equilibrium, can fail rapidly when subjected to the cyclic stress of earthquake shaking. The stronger and longer the shaking, the larger the area susceptible to slope failure, and the more simultaneous failures occur across a landscape. The Pacific Northwest geography makes it particularly vulnerable to earthquake-triggered landslides. The Cascades and Coast Ranges are steep, heavily forested, and in many areas contain saturated soils from seasonal rainfall. River valleys cut deeply through these ranges, creating slopes that are already stressed by erosion and slope processes. The region experiences active natural landsliding even without earthquakes. During the several minutes of severe shaking from a full Cascadia rupture, those slopes would fail across a very wide area. The consequences of simultaneous widespread landsliding compound the transportation problem created by bridge damage and road shaking damage. A highway that survives the shaking may still be blocked by a landslide deposit in a valley above or below it. Multiple simultaneous blockages on the same route, the normal pattern in a regional earthquake, can close transportation corridors that cross mountain terrain for weeks or months until the debris is cleared and the slope above the road is stabilized to prevent further failure. Rivers add another dimension. When large landslides enter river valleys, they can partially or completely dam the river behind them. Landslide dams are inherently unstable. They consist of loose, unconsolidated debris rather than engineered fill, and they are breached by the river's flow on timescales ranging from hours to months. When a natural landslide dam fails, the sudden release of the impounded water sends a flood wave downstream. That flood can reach communities far from the landslide site that may have no awareness that a dam formed upstream and no warning before the water arrives. Earthquake-triggered landslide dams are not theoretical. The 2008 Sichuan earthquake in China triggered hundreds of landslides, several of which dammed rivers and created hazardous impoundments. Chinese engineers worked for weeks to safely drain the largest of these, called Tangjishan Barrier Lake, before it could fail naturally and flood downstream communities. The management of that situation required military engineering resources and the evacuation of hundreds of thousands of people as a precaution. In the Pacific Northwest, the combination of steep terrain, saturated soils, and active river systems creates conditions where multiple simultaneous landslide dam events would be expected following a major Cascadia rupture. Managing those events would require rapid aerial assessment, engineering evaluation, and in some cases controlled intervention to safely lower reservoir levels before natural dam failure sends uncontrolled floods into already damaged valley communities. Emergency planners modeling the full Cascadia scenario account for this hazard, but public awareness of it remains low compared to the well-publicized tsunami and building collapse threats. The inland flooding risk from earthquake-triggered landslide dams represents an additional layer of delayed consequence that would complicate the recovery period well beyond the first days after the main event. Modern cities operate on supply chains calibrated to deliver essential goods with minimal warehoused inventory. Grocery stores carry days of stock, not weeks. Hospitals maintain medical supply inventories sized for expected patient volumes, with emergency margins that stretch to days rather than months. Fuel depots operate on rotating inventory systems designed for continuous resupply. Pharmacies stock medications based on regular delivery cycles. The entire system assumes that roads remain open, vehicles keep moving, and goods keep arriving. A major Cascadia earthquake breaks every assumption that system runs on, simultaneously and across an area roughly the size of California. The immediate supply chain failure begins with transportation. As documented in the Cascadia Rising exercise and the Oregon Resilience Plan modeling, a full Cascadia rupture would damage or destroy a significant portion of the Pacific Northwest's road and bridge network within minutes. The Interstate 5 corridor, the primary arterial connecting the region north to south and linking it to the national supply chain, crosses dozens of bridges and passes through areas of high liquefaction and shaking hazard. Even partial closures of this corridor would severely constrain the movement of commercial freight that the region depends on. Marine terminals in Portland, Seattle, and Tacoma handle a large portion of the goods that supply the Pacific Northwest, including food imports, fuel, and industrial materials. These facilities sit on waterfront land, much of it on fill and soft soil, adjacent to water that would experience both earthquake shaking and, in some scenarios, tsunami surge. Terminal infrastructure, including cranes, fuel storage, and loading facilities, would face significant damage risk. The ports that survived largely intact would still face access problems from damaged road and rail connections, linking them to the inland supply network. Food supply presents the starkest short-term crisis. Studies of urban food security in major disaster scenarios consistently find that most urban households have between 3 and 7 days of food available at home. Beyond that window, households depend on stores being restocked. In a scenario where roads are blocked, stores are damaged and delivery systems are disrupted for weeks. The gap between household food reserves and the first reliable resupply becomes a public health and social stability crisis in its own right. The medication supply chain creates a parallel crisis for the portion of the population dependent on regular prescription medications. Chronic disease management, psychiatric medications, insulin and related supplies for diabetic patients, and medications for cardiac conditions all have clinical consequences when interrupted for more than a few days. Emergency planners have modeled this gap and found that the segment of the population with time-sensitive medication needs is large enough that supply chain disruption would generate medical emergencies independent of direct earthquake injury. Prepositioning of emergency supplies, specifically storing food, water, fuel, and medical supplies in locations that are likely to remain accessible after a major earthquake, is the primary strategy for bridging the gap between the rupture and restored supply chain function. The Federal Emergency Supply System, maintained by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, includes pre-positioned warehouses in the Pacific Northwest. State emergency management agencies maintain their own reserve supplies, but independent assessments of the scale of those reserves against the population that would need them in a full Cascadia scenario consistently find the reserves insufficient for the duration of disruption the models project. Closing that gap requires sustained investment in pre-positioning inventory at scales that have not yet been committed. It also requires locating those supplies and structures on ground that will remain accessible after the earthquake, a requirement that itself demands the kind of soil-sensitive siting decisions that do not always drive government facility location choices. Long before geologists began digging trenches and measuring GPS displacement, the communities that lived along the Cascadia coast already carried knowledge of what this fault system does. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast, including the Huayat, Maka, Quileot, Quinault, and other nations whose territories span the region, maintained oral traditions that described catastrophic flooding events, sudden ground movement, and the loss of entire villages to waves that arrived without warning. These traditions were not widely integrated into the scientific understanding of Cascadia's hazard during the early decades of modern seismological research in the region. The paleoseismic community's recognition of Cascadia's great earthquake potential developed largely through the evidence in soil, sediment, and coastal landforms. But as that recognition grew and the 1700 rupture became established as a scientifically confirmed event, researchers began taking a closer look at the oral traditions of coastal indigenous communities and finding that the narratives aligned with the physical record in specific and meaningful ways. The Huayat Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island, whose territory sits directly in the path of Cascadia tsunami waves, preserves oral accounts of a great wave event that matches the timing and characteristics of the 1700 rupture. The Maka Nation on the northwestern tip of the Olympic Peninsula similarly maintains traditions that describe catastrophic inundation consistent with a major tsunami. Linguists and ethnogeographers who have studied these accounts note that they contain the kind of specific geographic and observational detail that reflects direct experience rather than mythological elaboration. The scientific value of these oral traditions lies in what they add to the physical record. Paleoseismic evidence establishes that ruptures occurred and constrains their timing and magnitude. Indigenous oral traditions can potentially add information about the human experience of those events, the duration of the shaking, the direction of the wave arrival, the extent of the inundation, and the time elapsed between the shaking and the water's arrival. These are details that coastal sediment records cannot easily provide, but that have direct relevance to modern emergency planning. Researchers have made efforts in recent years to engage directly with indigenous communities in the Pacific Northwest on questions of earthquake and tsunami hazard, recognizing both the scientific value of the oral record and the ethical importance of treating indigenous knowledge with appropriate respect and sovereignty. Some collaborative projects have documented oral traditions with community permission and analyzed their scientific content in ways that add nuance to the physical record of past events. The broader implication of this integration extends beyond the specific data points. The fact that oral traditions maintained by coastal communities across hundreds of miles of coastline independently converge on a similar catastrophic event is itself a form of corroboration. When the soil tells one version of the story, the trees tell another, the Japanese historical records tell a third, and the oral traditions of multiple indigenous nations tell a fourth, and all four versions point to the same event at the same time, with similar characteristics. The weight of that convergence is significant. The 1700 rupture was survived by communities who had no early warning system, no reinforced concrete towers, and no shake alert on their devices. The knowledge that it happened and what it looked like traveled forward in time through human memory. The question of whether the scientific and engineering knowledge now assembled about Cascadia's next rupture will travel forward into effective preparation is one that every level of government and every coastal community is still in the process of answering. Most people have experienced minor earthquake shaking, a brief vibration underfoot, objects swaying slightly on shelves, a sound like a distant truck passing. Even a moderate earthquake of magnitude 5 or 6, felt clearly and remembered vividly, gives no real sensory preparation for what a magnitude 8 or 9 produces at the surface. The relationship between magnitude and shaking intensity is not linear. Earthquake magnitude is measured on a logarithmic scale, meaning each whole number increase represents roughly 30 times more energy released. A magnitude 9 releases approximately 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 7. That energy difference translates into shaking that is categorically different in character, not just in degree. Ground motion recordings from major subduction zone earthquakes describe shaking that lasts several minutes, rather than the seconds familiar from smaller events. During the Tohoku earthquake, strong shaking in affected regions lasted between 2 and 5 minutes depending on location. Buildings that survived the first 30 seconds of shaking continued to experience cyclic loading for several more minutes. Structural materials that can tolerate brief stress sometimes fail under sustained cyclic loading of this duration. The extended duration is one reason why subduction zone earthquakes cause more cumulative damage than inland fault earthquakes of comparable peak intensity. The motion during a major subduction zone earthquake also has a distinct character. In addition to the back and forth horizontal motion most commonly depicted, there is a vertical component, an up and down movement, and a rolling quality described by survivors of major events as feeling like the ground has become a liquid surface. People standing outdoors cannot remain on their feet. The ground appears to move in waves. Solid objects behave unpredictably. The visual and sensory experience is profoundly disorienting in ways that training and knowledge partially but incompletely prepare a person for. Inside buildings, the experience depends heavily on the building type and the local soil conditions. In a well-engineered modern structure on firm ground, the building may sway significantly but remain standing, with objects thrown from shelves and non-structural damage visible throughout. In an older unreinforced masonry building on soft soil, the combination of amplified and extended shaking can cause rapid and complete structural failure within the first minute. The occupants have no practical warning that the building is collapsing until it already is. After the shaking stops, the environment is fundamentally altered. Power is out across wide areas. Water pressure has dropped or failed. Gas smells indicate ruptured lines. Dust from damaged structures fills the air. Roads are visibly damaged, cracked, or blocked. The sounds of car alarms, building alarms, and people calling for help create an acoustic environment that is disorienting after the silence that precedes the first shaking wave. Emergency services are simultaneously overwhelmed at every location across the affected region. The practical implication of understanding the physical character of a magnitude 9 is that the window for self-protective action during the shaking itself is very short. The most effective responses drop, cover, hold on, staying away from windows and heavy furniture, moving toward shelter under a structural element, must happen immediately and without deliberation. The seconds before the peak shaking arrives are the most consequential seconds an occupant of a building in the affected area has. What they do in those seconds, and whether they have practiced doing it without thinking, determines whether they are found standing or buried when the shaking finally stops. The slow slip events described earlier in this story occur at predictable depth ranges, on the portion of the Cascadia Fault that transitions between locked and freely sliding behavior. But below that slow slip zone, extending deeper into the crust and into the mantle wedge beneath the North American plate, a different, and in some ways more complex set of processes is operating. And researchers are only beginning to understand what those deeper processes mean for the overall behavior of the fault system above them. The zone below the slow slip region is where the subducting Juan de Fuca plate is warm enough, and the pressure is high enough that the plate boundary rocks are relatively weak and capable of deforming without brittle failure. Fluids released from the subducting plate as it heats up, and minerals dehydrate migrate upward through this zone and into the base of the overlying crust. Those fluids affect the mechanical behavior of the fault system in ways that are still being studied, but are known to be significant. Fluid pressure along fault surfaces reduces the effective stress that holds fault rocks together, making them easier to slip. High fluid pressure in the slow slip zone is one mechanism researchers have proposed to explain why that zone slips slowly and repeatedly, rather than locking and releasing in discrete earthquakes. The same fluid system, operating over longer timescales, potentially influences the behavior of the locked zone above, by altering the conditions at the boundary between locked and creeping behavior. Seismic imaging of the Cascadia Subduction Zone has revealed reflective layers in the deep crust that some researchers interpret as zones of high fluid concentration. These bright reflectors, visible in seismic surveys, suggest that significant volumes of fluid are present in the system, potentially at high pressure. Understanding how those fluids migrate, where they concentrate, and how their pressure changes over time is relevant to understanding the mechanical evolution of the locked zone and the potential for triggering or delaying rupture. This is an area of genuinely active scientific debate. The role of fluids in subduction zone earthquake cycles is studied intensively at Cascadia, Japan, Chile, Alaska, and other active subduction zones worldwide. The conclusions from that research are not yet settled enough to translate directly into specific predictions or hazard modifications, but the research is advancing rapidly and has already changed the understanding of why slow slip events occur on the regular cycle they do. What the deeper fault research adds to the Cascadia story is a reminder that the fault system is a dynamic, interconnected mechanical system operating over a range of depths and timescales simultaneously. The locked zone where the next great earthquake will begin is not isolated. It sits within a larger system that includes the slow slip zone below it, the fluid-rich deep fault above the subducting plate, and the broader stress environment of the Pacific Northwest crust. Understanding how those components interact is the scientific frontier that will eventually produce better constraints on the hazard, even if it cannot yet produce precise predictions. The monitoring systems being deployed across and around the Cascadia system are specifically designed to capture this full system behavior in real time, building a record that will be invaluable both for scientific understanding and for the next generation of probabilistic hazard models that emergency planners depend on. Translating seismic hazard into preparedness requirements means converting scientific probability and engineering vulnerability assessments into the specific quantities of physical resources, trained personnel, and functional infrastructure that a region would need to survive a major earthquake and recover from it. When those requirements are compared against what currently exists across the Pacific Northwest, the resulting numbers define what emergency managers call the preparedness gap. Those numbers are large, and they are not classified. They have been published, presented to legislators, and described in public reports for over a decade. The Oregon Resilience Plan estimated that achieving genuine community resilience to a Cascadia earthquake across Oregon would require tens of billions of dollars in infrastructure investment over approximately 50 years. That investment would cover bridge retrofits and replacements, water system upgrades, hospital improvements, school seismic safety, coastal evacuation infrastructure, and emergency supply pre-positioning. The 50-year timeline was not chosen arbitrarily. It reflects a realistic assessment of the engineering, construction, and financial capacity available to pursue this work in parallel with maintaining existing systems and addressing other infrastructure needs. Hospital capacity represents one of the most concrete and most troubling numbers in the preparedness gap assessment. Major Cascadia rupture scenario modeling projects tens of thousands of injuries requiring medical care in the immediate aftermath of the event. The combined trauma surgery capacity and general hospital bed availability across Oregon and Washington, even accounting for full surge protocols and emergency field hospitals, falls substantially short of the projected need. The shortfall is not marginal. It is significant enough that emergency planners routinely include medical triage and care rationing protocols in their Cascadia response planning, acknowledging openly that the existing system cannot treat every person who would need care. Search and rescue capacity shows a similar gap. The Pacific Northwest has several federal emergency management agency certified urban search and rescue teams, regional teams, and local first responder units, with specialized training. In a major Cascadia event, the number of collapsed structures requiring technical search and rescue operations, involving specialized equipment to locate and extract survivors from rubble, would exceed the available team capacity by a large margin across the affected area. Mutual aid from other regions would be needed, but the same earthquake affecting Oregon and Washington would also impact Northern California, and the National Urban Search and Rescue System has finite total capacity. Emergency housing is another quantified gap. Scenario modeling for a full Cascadia rupture projects displacement of over 1 million people from homes that are damaged, destroyed, or located in zones requiring evacuation for tsunami or aftershock reasons. The emergency shelter capacity of the affected states, using schools, community centers, fairgrounds, and similar facilities, falls well short of that number. Longer-term temporary housing, the kind of manufactured units deployed after Hurricane Katrina, requires months to procure and install at the scale needed, during which time displaced populations cycle through shelter systems with limited capacity and declining conditions. The gap numbers are not presented here to suggest that preparation is futile. They are presented because they describe a specific bounded and addressable problem. The distance between current capacity and required capacity is measurable, and it shrinks with each bridge that is retrofitted, each hospital that is upgraded, each coastal evacuation tower that is built, and each household that stores emergency supplies and practices its family earthquake plan. The aggregate of those individual and institutional actions is what determines in the end whether the next Cascadia rupture is a catastrophe that the Pacific Northwest survives and recovers from, or one that it is, in important ways, still recovering from a generation later. Scientific consensus does not form quickly, and it does not form loudly. It builds over years and decades through the accumulation of consistent findings from independent researchers using different methods at different sites, converging on the same conclusions. When that consensus reaches a point where the scientific community speaks about a hazard with a single voice across disciplines and institutions, it carries a weight that individual studies cannot. Cascadia has reached that point. The convergence of evidence on Cascadia's hazard now spans paleoseismology, geodesy, seismology, tsunami modeling, and fault mechanics. Researchers from the United States Geological Survey, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, university programs at Oregon State, the University of Washington, University of Oregon, Simon Fraser, and the University of Victoria, and international collaborators from Japan, Canada, and Europe have all contributed to a body of research that is internally consistent and mutually reinforcing. The locked fault is real. The stored energy is real. The geological record of past ruptures is real. The tsunami generation mechanism is real and well modeled. The consensus on the hazard level has driven a corresponding consensus in the preparedness community. Major reports from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the United States Geological Survey, state geological surveys in Oregon and Washington, and independent engineering organizations have all reached similar conclusions about the scale of preparation required and the current level of preparation available. The gap they identify is consistent across independent assessments. The priority actions they recommend are aligned. The urgency they express has been increasing. What the scientific community is now wrestling with, at the leading edge of Cascadia research, is not whether the hazard is real, but whether any precursory signals, detectable in advance of the rupture, exist and can be monitored. The search for reliable earthquake precursors has a long and largely unsuccessful history in seismology. Most major earthquakes have occurred without clear detectable warning signals in the days or weeks before they ruptured. Some researchers have proposed that changes in slow slip behavior, groundwater levels, or very small seismic event patterns might carry information about stress changes on locked faults. But none of these potential precursors have been validated as reliable predictors of large ruptures. The Cascadia Monitoring Network provides a richer real-time data stream than was available at any previous subduction zone before a major rupture occurred. If a major Cascadia event is preceded by detectable anomalies in slow slip timing, tremor character, or surface deformation, the instruments now in place have a chance of capturing those anomalies. Whether the scientific community would be able to interpret them as precursory signals in real time with enough confidence to justify action is a question that cannot be answered from the current state of knowledge. What scientists are confident about is the behavior of the system at longer timescales. The fault is loaded. The probability window is real. The consequences of rupture are well characterized. The preparation required to reduce those consequences is documented. The remaining distance between where the Pacific Northwest stands today and where it needs to be to face a major Cascadia earthquake with reasonable resilience is the central problem that the expanding scientific consensus is pressing, with increasing directness for society to address. Against the scale of the preparation gap, a set of concrete actions is underway across the Pacific Northwest that represents real, measurable reduction in risk. These actions range from individual household preparedness to major public infrastructure projects. And while none of them individually closes the full gap, collectively they demonstrate that the preparedness problem, for all its scale, is one that communities are actively engaging rather than deferring indefinitely. Oregon's Seismic Safety Policy Advisory Commission has driven a sustained effort to identify and address the state's most vulnerable public buildings, including schools and emergency facilities. School seismic safety has received particular attention, driven by the recognition that school buildings represent both a concentrated child population and, in many cases, structures built before modern seismic codes that would be expected to perform poorly in a major event. Oregon has passed legislation establishing seismic rehabilitation standards for schools and allocated funding for assessments and retrofits, though the full inventory of work identified through those assessments exceeds current funding commitments. Washington State has implemented a similar program, targeting its most critical public facilities. The Washington State Department of Natural Resources has produced and regularly updated its earthquake and tsunami hazard maps, making high-quality hazard information publicly accessible in formats useful to local governments, engineers, and the public. The state has also invested in expanding its contributions to the Shake Alert network and in the offshore monitoring infrastructure that improves detection capability for offshore Cascadia events. At the community level, the coastal town of Seaside, Oregon, has engaged seriously with its tsunami risk, conducting detailed assessments of its inundation zone, working with the state to develop vertical evacuation planning, and maintaining active public communication about what residents should do when the ground shakes and the ocean pulls back. Seaside sits almost entirely within the projected Cascadia tsunami inundation zone, making its engagement with this risk a matter of institutional and community survival rather than abstract planning. Individual household preparedness, while difficult to measure precisely, has grown in the Pacific Northwest, driven by public education campaigns, community emergency response team training programs, and the increasing accessibility of earthquake preparedness information. Local organizations have distributed earthquake preparedness kits, conducted training programs in neighborhoods, and built neighborhood-level communication networks designed to function when commercial communications fail. The private sector has also contributed to risk reduction, though unevenly. Some major employers in the Pacific Northwest have invested in building assessments and structural improvements for their facilities. Technology companies whose operations depend on continuous power and network access have invested in backup systems and redundancy that, as a byproduct, also improve their resilience to earthquake disruption. Insurance industry engagement with seismic risk has driven increased structural assessments by commercial building owners seeking to manage their coverage costs. None of these actions, taken individually or collectively, transforms the Pacific Northwest into a fully prepared region. The scale of what remains to be done exceeds what has been accomplished. But the fact that preparation is advancing at all, across multiple jurisdictions and sectors simultaneously, reflects a serious societal engagement with the Cascadia hazard that would not have been possible without the scientific work that established its reality and described its scale. The trajectory is the right one. The pace is the variable that still concerns the people who spend their careers studying what this fault will eventually do. 325 years of stored elastic energy sits locked in rock beneath the Pacific Ocean off the coast of the Pacific Northwest. The geological record confirms this fault breaks. The GPS measurements confirm the strain is there. The probabilistic models assign it a real and substantial likelihood within the planning horizon of every building being constructed, every infrastructure project being designed, and every emergency system being built in the region today. The science is not uncertain about the existence of the hazard. It is uncertain only about the timing. That uncertainty cuts in two directions. It means the rupture could come tomorrow, or it could come in another century. Emergency planners cannot design their systems around a specific date, because no such date exists. What they can do, and what the scientific community has increasingly pressed them to do, is design their systems around the consequence rather than the timing. A region that is prepared for the consequence does not need to know when the rupture comes. It needs to have the bridges, the hospitals, the evacuation routes, the trained personnel, and the emergency supplies in place before the ground moves. The window of time before the next Cascadia rupture is the most valuable resource the Pacific Northwest currently possesses. Every bridge retrofit completed within that window is a bridge that does not fall. Every coastal evacuation tower built is a structure that saves the people who reach it. Every unreinforced masonry building addressed is a building that does not collapse on its occupants. Every household with a 3-week emergency supply eliminates one family from the demand on emergency food distribution systems, already overwhelmed by millions of people in simultaneous need. The value of preparation is not abstract. It is countable in the specific outcomes that differ between a region that prepared and one that did not. The scientific community's shift toward more direct public communication about Cascadia is itself a form of action, and it reflects a considered judgment that the most important variable now limiting the pace of preparation is public and political awareness of what the science actually shows. The researchers who have spent careers studying this fault believe the evidence is compelling enough and the preparation gap large enough that maintaining measured scientific detachment no longer serves the public interest as well as speaking clearly does. The Tohoku earthquake killed nearly 20,000 people in one of the world's most prepared nations. Its specific death toll, in the context of Japan's prior investment in seismic preparation, reflects how far preparation can go in reducing casualties from an event of this scale. It also reflects the hard ceiling imposed by physics. No amount of preparation eliminates all risk from a magnitude 9 subduction zone earthquake. What preparation does is move the outcome from catastrophic and society-altering to devastating but recoverable. The Pacific Northwest has the scientific knowledge, the engineering capability, the institutional infrastructure, and, in principle, the financial resources to close the preparation gap that exists between where it stands today and where it needs to be. What it requires is sustained commitment over the years and decades that remain available before the fault releases the energy it has been storing since 1700. The clock on that commitment is running alongside the clock on the fault itself. The scientists who study Cascadia are not quietly preparing for the worst earthquake in decades because they enjoy alarming people. They are preparing because the evidence they have spent their careers assembling leaves them no other rational response. The question they are now asking publicly, and with increasing urgency, is whether the rest of the region will join them in time.